Thank you. We now move to the next item on our agenda, the report by Mr. Nart, Cutting the Sources of Income for Jihadists, Targeting the Financing of Terrorism. And I invite the rapporteur, Mr. Nart, to take the floor now, please.
Gracias, señora Presidente.
Thank you, Madam President. The defeat of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria doesn't mean that it has ceased to exist. It still holds a huge amount of money, which it built up during its caliphate by selling oil, taking over legitimate firms, imposing revolutionary taxes, robberies, theft of antiques and the sale of arms. We're talking about approximately 400 million euro that is expected it has been laundered in Syria and Iraq. Bearing in mind that the approximate amount of turnover at the time of the caliphate was something like $80 million per month. In this recommendation, we seek to ensure that these funds cannot be used, laundered. We can't have them carrying out trade with their loot. We need coordinated action amongst the intelligence services, and so we propose to the Commission and the Member States and the EAS that we have an across-the-board vision stepping up cooperation amongst European intelligence services. We need across-the-board European intelligence platform where they can pool information on inquiries. That's of strategic importance. We don't just want to set up a new institution, rather we want to take a realistic approach and provide a platform for cooperation where there is a pool of data that can be shared. This should be based on what Europol already has. We want a proactive exchange of information on the funding of terrorist organizations. We also encourage the member states to redouble their efforts to ensure they recruit skilled computer specialists who can thoroughly investigate suspicious financial transactions. And then, taking up the fifth money laundering directive, we must make sure that the national financial intelligence units are better equipped and have proper access to banking data. And as part of the investigation, virtual currencies and prepayment instruments must be included. Up until now, people could obtain funding anonymously by means of those, and we have to bring an end to that. There's a fundamental responsibility here. Virtual currencies and cloud funding are used by terrorists. New technologies, by their very nature, are cross-border, and so must our response to terrorism be on a cross-border footing. The exchange of information and the traceability of financial information in relation to terrorism is something we're already doing, but not in Europe. In the single European payments area, we need this. So we call on the Commission to complement the international system with a joint European system. And at the same time, we must stringently enforce data protection standards and the fundamental rights which define us in the European Union as being people who respect human rights. In the European Union, we have to look at hawala and other traditional means of transferring funds. They have to be regulated by a register of financial transactions that it would be compulsory to record. Just as when any of our citizens transfers money abroad, that is done in a controlled way. There has to be equality before the law. It's not an instance of discrimination. Traditional Islamic financial arrangements have been used by ISIS to transfer funds to the Middle East, and some of this money has come to Europe. And in Europe, we need to devote our attention to certain cultural centres and supposed charity organisations when there is reason to suppose that they have links to terrorism, and make sure there's no negligent or improper use of funds. All of this is in conjunction with fighting Islamophobia, a new type of racism. Terrorism, jihadism is a blasphemy against the Quran. and the main victims of jihadist activity are Muslims. In our external action, in our missions funded from the Common Defence and Security Policy, and as part of our assistance to building up resilience in countries which are victims of terrorism, the fight against the funding of terrorism has to be part of our endeavours. In particular, we must ensure that funds captured by terrorists cannot be laundered via legitimate business activity in those countries. Lastly, I'd like to thank the colleagues I've negotiated with, as well as Commissioner King, with whom I've had an exchange of views on our proposed recommendations. My intention was that the text be reasonable and realistic, and I welcome the fact that my efforts to strike a difficult balance between freedom and security have enjoyed the consensus backing of all the political groups. Thanks to them all.
Thank you, and thank you, colleagues. We now invite Commissioner King to take the floor.
Terrorists need to raise and move funds to maintain their networks, cover their logistical needs, and commit their attacks. We need to close down the space in which they can do this. Countering terrorist financing is not only about limiting their capacity to act, but also about, as we've just heard, using financial intelligence to detect and stop terrorists before they act. Recent attacks perpetrated in Europe have been financed with relatively small sums of money. And that poses some new challenges to those who are working on the front line to prevent terrorist attacks. We need to give law enforcement and our public authorities the tools they need to do their job and to help keep us safe. So I very much welcome the timely recommendations in this report. Tackling terrorist financing is a high priority for all of us. From the Commission's side, it's a key part of our work to build an effective security union. Our approach was set out in the Action Plan for Strengthening the Fight Against Terrorist Financing of February 2016. And we're now taking that work forward on two fronts: detecting and preventing terrorist funding and disrupting the sources of revenue. And that covers a range of different measures. Preventing the misuse of the financial system for money laundering and terrorist financing, increasing cooperation and the exchange of information between competent authorities, in particular financial intelligence units, tracing the financial movements of terrorists, improving the effectiveness of asset freezing systems, reinforcing the judicial response to terrorist financing and money laundering, supporting third countries in countering terrorist financing and money laundering in their implementation of the Financial Action Task Force standards, supporting customs authorities with tools to identify sources of revenue of terrorist organizations, and supporting third countries as they engage with international partners, not only through the FATF, as I mentioned, but also other bodies such as the Anti-ISIS Coalition Working Group on countering financing of terrorism, and indeed the work that's done in the framework of the G7. So I'm glad to see that many of the report's recommendations are in line with the work that we are undertaking. We welcome the emphasis in the report on information sharing, in particular among financial intelligence units as well as other national agencies. We welcome your support for the establishment of central bank account registries. I'm glad to say, as announced in the Commission Work Programme for this year, we will soon present initiatives to improve cross-border access to financial data for law enforcement authorities. This will include measures to facilitate access to national centralised bank account registries and retrieval systems within Member States. We will also propose measures to improve the cooperation between law enforcement authorities and the various financial intelligence units. In line with the report's recommendations, we've reinforced Europol's role in this fight against terrorist financing. We take note of the call for increasing monitoring of prepaid cards. The fifth Anti-Money Laundering Directive is a step forward, I think, in reinforcing the transparency around this means of payment. With its list of non-cooperative jurisdictions, the EU is also acting to increase the exchange of information on tax matters with third countries, as you've been discussing. This will help national administrations to detect the presence of illicit money and money laundering. We appreciate your support for the EU-US terrorist finance tracking programme, and we take note of your call for a European system to complement that. On asset freezing, we appreciate the report's support for existing measures. The EU's asset freezing efforts have been reinforced with the autonomous EU regime against Al-Qaeda and Daesh. We appreciate the emphasis on Hawala. In the supranational risk assessment of money laundering and terrorism financing risks, the Commission recommended that Hawala service providers should apply the requirements related to money transfer systems under the Payment Services Directive and the Anti-Money Laundering Directive, and we're committed to keeping this particular sector under close review. In relation to high-value goods, I'd like to underline that the proposal to amend the cash control regulation expands the definition of cash to gold and other high-value commodities. We appreciate your support for our proposed regulation on the import of cultural goods. This issue remains of high importance in addressing the problem of cultural goods being illegally taken from third countries, from their proper historical and archaeological context, and being brought to the EU. This can, in turn, foster organised crime, terrorist financing, money laundering and tax evasion. Member States should also soon adopt the Commission's proposals to strengthen the VAT system and reinforce the collective fight against VAT fraud, which again can feed criminal and terrorist organisations. So, in a nutshell, I'm glad that the work the Commission is doing in this area is in line with many of the measures you call for and support in today's report. Some other new measures you suggest merit further analysis. We will take a careful look at them and we will come back to you on them. Countering financing of terrorism is a core component of the EU strategy in the fight against terrorism and hence in our work to build an effective security union. As the terrorists and their supporters constantly modify and change the ways they collect, move and get access to funds, we need to be ready to adopt and adapt our response. The EU needs to adapt its instruments and measures to deprive terrorists of the space and the means they use as they seek to do us harm. I count on your continued support as we take this work forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I now give the floor to our first speaker for 1.5 minutes, Mr. Adak Toussaint.
Madam Speaker, first I would like to congratulate my colleague, Javier Nart, for a well-drafted report. Despite the defeat of ISIS, we are not in the position to declare victory over terrorism. Instead, we should learn from both the rise and fall of the Islamic State. One lesson is that a combination of military means and cutting off the financial lifeblood of ISIS has paved the way for its departure. Another lesson is that after the dismantling of an organization like ISIS, there will be a vacuum. Certain actors will do their utmost to fill that space with new jihadist organizations, and for that they will need money. Cutting funding sources of terrorist networks should therefore be considered a key priority. It constitutes an effective tool hampering the effectiveness of these networks. To achieve this, implementation is crucial. The member states should deliver, for instance, when it comes to exchange of intelligence. With common efforts, the EU is able to cope with the bloodstream of jihadism, the capital flow that today finances international terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Moody, 1.5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, President. And I would also like to thank the rapporteur and my fellow shadow rapporteurs for the constructive way in which we have worked together. I believe this has led to a good report with realistic recommendations. The changes we suggested in this report can be embraced by law enforcement bodies across Europe, for example, by creating a platform where data can be shared. The small amounts of money that are needed for terrorists to carry out their criminal acts in our cities mean that we need to be better at monitoring even small transactions, including traditional forms of exchange such as hawala. We also need to recognise that Daesh move money into legitimate businesses, but in countries with weak institutions, which is why we need to support institution building in fragile states. This report also stresses that while we must deal with terrorist financing, it is ultimately through tackling the root causes of poverty, social exclusion and human rights abuses that we will defeat the destructive ideology that breeds terrorism. I have mentioned just a few of the examples of the practical solutions that are outlined in this report. Our citizens rightly expect us to keep them safe, and that is why I believe this report is important. It is a demonstration of the practical ways that the EU works for the people across Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Tannock.
Madam President, it goes without saying that tackling and tracking terrorist financial resources is one of the key tools in our fight against global terrorism. I too welcome many of the recommendations in the Nart report and strongly support the overall endorsement of greater cooperation amongst the EU member states in this area. It's clear that terrorism and its financing knows no borders, and this can only be tackled at the multilateral level. As the UK and in fact in the UK there is some evidence that ISIS may well have sold some of its antiquities smuggled out. As the UK leaves the EU, external and internal security will be one of the key areas where it's vital, no matter what else transpires, for Britain to stay plugged in. So I welcome the Prime Minister Mrs May's positive comments in this regard during her Munich Security Conference speech, and I hope that accommodation can be found to avoid a security cliff edge if no deal were to transpire during phase 2 of the negotiations. Finding ways to ensure data protection regulation alignment between the UK and the EU post-Brexit will also be one of the keys to unlocking coordination in the long term between the EU 27 and a post-Brexit Britain. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Woutmans, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues.
I'd like to thank my colleague Javier Nart for his excellent work and the very relevant initiative. Gracias, Javier. Want collega's, de burgers...
Because, colleagues, the citizens expect us to take action against terrorists, and so we also need to ensure that we cut off the funding for terrorism. And for that reason, I think it's extremely important that the recommendations that we are sending from the Parliament to the Commission and the Commissioner today to ensure that those sources of funding dry up. They are very concrete proposals. You summed it up, Commissioner. More control over big and small transactions, more control over prepaid cards, looking at financial flows and donations going abroad to mosques, etc. We can't be naive about this. Terrorists need funding if they are to carry out terrorist attacks. And I think that financial intelligence platforms should be established. That is also one of our recommendations. But I would also go further. Since 2014 in Europe, there have been 17 attacks in Europe. And if you look at the perpetrators, most of them were covered in one or more databases. So I would like to ask you to make a statement on that as well. We have to move forward and develop a true European intelligence service.
Thank you. 1.5 minutes now for Madam Sakorafa.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to thank Mr. Nart because he's managed to give a balanced presentation of a complex topic. 19 years after the first UN vote, there are increasing numbers of terrorist organizations with increasing resources. We can't accept that the international financial system is used for these organizations to tap funding, and all means are used by terrorists to secure financing. There are a number of other cases in Europe of capital flows supporting terrorists. It's hypocritical to say we're fighting terrorists but working with states who are promoting their support. So, Commissioner, can you tell us about the countries with which the EU is working, even though it's quite clear that directly or indirectly they are co-funding terrorism? Please give us a list. Tell us which ones are supporting terrorist organizations. We need to break off these flows of financing to terrorists. Better governance in the regions concerned should be what we work on. We need to be honest about this and call a spade if we want to change things.
Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, we cannot help but welcome the work carried out by our rapporteur. It's extremely important in the current context. I wish to draw your attention to two omissions, two gaps that we must plug. First of all, transparency in banking transactions. We're told that banking transactions are too important to warrant a root and branch reform, but it seems to me that transparency and measures designed to end tax havens would be welcome, since this could stem the flow of terrorist funding. And another omission is ideology. Very often terrorists operate on an ideological basis. The member states will be well advised to take action to encourage democratic, moderate religious-based movements to emerge, giving other means for members of minority religions to speak out.
Thank you, Commissioner. Despite the myriad rules and regulations introduced into the banking system, I strongly believe that the only way to stop the flow of funds to jihadists is to physically deny them their safe havens. We know that sympathisers raise funds across the globe and extort money through kidnapping and other crimes to support these wicked people. However, the greatest funding comes from control of a territory, especially territories such as we have seen in Iraq, with natural resources such as oil and gas. Madam President, it is imperative that we prevent jihadists from controlling such areas, and incumbent on nation states, not the European Union, to protect their citizens by empowering their military forces to take whatever necessary action. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Monsieur Martin.
Thank you, Madam President. Madrid, London, Paris. We have been waiting for this report for over 10 years. Do we need to recall the fact that terrorists have killed 2,004 people in Europe since 2001, and that Daesh has an income of $3 billion per year? Of course, we have to ensure that we are not participating in this financing, particularly through our oil purchases. But what are we proposing, or what are you proposing to us? To hand our security to the European institutions and banking sector? Out of $100 laundered in the world, banks only intercept 40 cents. It's nothing. So that shows how powerless they are. And the European institutions, and I quote Mrs. Mogherini, our Vice President and High Representative, she said that political Islam has a place in Europe. political Islam has a place in Europe. Do you really want to hand our security to these people?
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Epitideos.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Some might want to defeat terrorists militarily, but in order to fight terrorism effectively, you need to staunch their financing. That will stop the terrorists in their tracks. At the moment, they're financing their activities through banks in Western and Arabic countries. And often it's small amounts from small companies and SMEs that are used to exploit the banking system. We need close cooperation, therefore, between all authorities and the intelligence services of the countries concerned, so that there really is an effective exchange of information. Banks must be checked. We need to get an insight into suspect customers. That doesn't mean dropping privacy protection, and it's not about political opponents.
Javier Nart's report is extremely important. Daesh hasn't come to an end, even if it has been territorially defeated. The same applies to organizations linked to Al-Qaeda. The UN Security Council they point out we can only deal with the MENA region in particular if we tackle the geopolitical concerns of the various countries. Blocking the financing of terrorist networks by use of Hawala and other methods is crucial. But we also have to look at investments in Iraq and Turkey legitimate businesses, but also in the European Union. Mr. Moscovici pointed out a year ago in the report on VAT that 150 million euros per year is recycled by terrorist organizations, including by criminal organizations, including terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda. Our member states are still refusing the reforms to the VAT system that were proposed to tackle this. A number of member states have still not worked on the recommendations of the previous directive, and they haven't worked on the setting up of a European Financial Intelligence Unit as proposed under the fifth directive. That's crucial if we're to fight terrorism funding.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Vistisen.
Glædeligt, at Europaparlamentet med den rapport.
It's a good thing that the European Parliament is taking this report today in order to create a platform to tackle terrorist financing, and so that we take the threat of terrorism seriously. For many years we have been constrained in the legislation we have adopted on terrorism, and I think now we're going to have a PNR adopted, and now we're moving ahead with the fight against terrorist financing as well. Now, a series of amendments that were tabled may have made this report more effective in fighting against terrorism, but unfortunately they were voted down, which is a shame. State sponsoring of terrorism in the Middle East hasn't been focused on enough in this report, and I hope that we will be able to respond to that challenge of state-sponsored terrorism more efficiently and compared to what the Foreign Affairs Committee adopted.
Voorzitter, Europa is de afgelopen
President, in recent years, Europe has been struck a number of times by Islamist and Islamist-inspired terrorist acts. There are more than 5,000 radicalized Muslims in Europe, according to estimates, but the word Islam is not mentioned at any point in the report, not even once. What our Parliament is doing is just a drop in the ocean. The purpose of the report is good, but it doesn't go far enough. You talk about Islamophobia and supposed attacks on Muslims, while 99% of all terrorist murders in 2015 were committed by Muslims. and 95% in 2016. Those aren't my figures, Madam President. These are Europol figures. And then I'll be labelled an Islamophobe, while the word Islam is not mentioned. This is the word on its head. As far as we're concerned, Madam President, there's no place in Europe for jihadists and radicalised Muslims. We have to close them down immediately. Thank you.
Mr. Kofu, 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much, Madam President. There are big concrete blocks all over central Copenhagen, and the same thing applies across other European cities. It's an attempt to avoid attacks using these rogue vehicles that have wrought so much havoc. Now we've put in big concrete blocks in city centres, and here we're talking about figurative concrete blocks to stop terrorist financing. Unfortunately, too many banks have profited from terrorism. We need to know whose pocket the money is ending up into. It's high time. Some banks are therefore funding terrorist activities. There is trickery, there's diversion of money, there's money laundering, and a underground economy is being created, and we need to fight against the investment banks that have caused so much harm. Thank you for this excellent report, Mr. Nart, and any decisions that we take today.
Thank you. And now for Mr. Jambaski, 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair, colleagues. In the recent years, we have discussed on numerous occasions the security of EU citizens. Extreme terrorist groups act actively in our territory. We discussed Daesh, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra and other threats on our way of life. During the war, this terrorist organization lost nearly 90% of their territory and many of their fighters. Therefore, they returned to their cell structure. This is not a victory for us. This is a small step to defeat jihadism. Trade in oil now has been limited, and therefore Islamic State has shifted to selling narcotics. We have to put strict rules as to cutting off financing. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Now, to catch the eye, I will take the 7 speakers on the list, but 1 minute will be the max. So, Mr. Salafranca, you will set the scene. 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to thank Mr. Nart for this report, which focuses on a central concern of our citizens, and it has the merit of setting out a range of specific proposals. For example, a stable platform for financial intelligence under Europol, a list of banking institutions with emissions in money laundering, or a list of third countries where we can provide financial assistance and strengthen them against terrorism. I think we can welcome this cooperation between FATF and its partners. There's a range of duties incumbent upon the Commission here. It has to apply adequate pressure to the Council to make sure that the Member States and the ES can put us in a position where we can come up with an adequate response to this scourge which is striking our societies.
Thank you, Mr. Salafranca. Mr. Frunzulică, 1 minute.
Commissioner, dear colleagues, first of all, from 2014 to 2017, in 4 years, we have seen 45 big terrorist attacks in Europe that caused hundreds of victims. This situation cannot continue, Commissioner. The security of EU citizens has to become the first priority of the European Union specialized institutions. I believe that law enforcement and prevention strategy are important both among EU member states and within the European Union's external relations. The fight against Daesh and Al-Qaeda should remain at the top of the security agenda in Europe, but of course in the Middle East as well, and not be diverted, especially in the Middle East, to pursuing particular political and sectarian agendas of the regional actors. I strongly believe that in our fight against terrorism, we need to focus our efforts on police and judicial cooperation and on exchanging information and data and good practices so as to strengthen synergies in the global draft to combat financing of terrorism.
I now give the floor to Mr. Marias. 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Madam President. Cutting off sources of terrorist financing means that we have to tackle the sources of jihadism, which implies that we would have to control Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Turkey, the countries which are supporting terrorism, who've been using contraband oil sales to fund terrorism. So that's, I think, what we need to focus on. And all of the others who are playing the game of terrorism. So there are very specific things that we need to do. We also need to control the high volumes of money circulating in football. There are countries which have bought football clubs and which may have an influence in this way.
Στο εξαιρετικά σημαντικό πρόβλημα της τρομοκρατίας.
Thank you, President. This is a particularly important problem, especially when we're talking about Islamic terrorism. We can brook no tolerance either of the terrorists themselves or their proponents, but so far no serious measures have been put in place to tackle the financing of terrorism and their organisations. Take Turkey as an example. It's an open secret that the caliphate is using illegal trade in oil to finance itself with Turkey and Kuwait and other countries have provided money which has financed terrorism, and the role of these countries must be explored. Financing has been prevented when it has been described as charity. There should be sanctions not just against individuals but also against countries.
Danke, Frau Vorsitzende. Ich möchte dem
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank the Foreign Affairs Committee for its own initiative report on combating the sources of terrorist financing. I think this is an important impetus for the Parliament to finally make progress in this area. The results of the Athena and Pandora 2 operations were published last week, with the 114,000 illegal art transactions. A large number of those were confiscated, because that is also a very significant source of financing in addition to arms trafficking, and that is something that was established by the UN already in 2015. A lack of customs duties has helped this kind of business model to operate and has financed terrorist attacks in Europe as a result. So I call on the Parliament and all of the Member States to improve their customs system, training of custom officers, and improve international cooperation in this area, because only in this way we'll be able to stop illegal trade of cultural goods.
Tomatic, 1 minute, please.
Ukidanje izvora prihoda džihadističkim organizacijama.
Thank you. The financing of terrorist groups is something that needs to be tackled to effectively deal with terrorism, and I would support all mechanisms which will help us fight terrorism, including a better scrutiny of religious organisations about which it has been alleged that they're involved in terrorist financing, but this should not have adverse effects for innocent citizens. Aid for terrorism, be it direct or indirect, often comes from us ourselves, because our foreign policy, which is hypocritical, refuses to take action against those countries funding terrorism, and that also beefs up jihadism. We need to be more consistent and more cautious ourselves. We need a real strategy and should not be engaged in machinations.
Getting a blue card, madam, or is catch the eye? Was it catch the eye? Okay, will the speaker accept a blue card? Madam Tomacic? Yes, go ahead, please. 30 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Basically, I agree with what you said, but you said, amongst other things, that we are responsible, we are guilty for not putting in place adequate measures. So can you explain what the Parliament, what the EU and what the Commission should have done to put an end to the funding of terrorism and terrorist acts? Because it's all right to criticise, but you need to offer solutions. Thank you.
Kolegice, vi jako dobro znate da neke države članice.
Well, colleague, as you know, some member states are continuing to trade with those they should not be trading with, as we know. So people say one thing and then do another. And if we want to fight against terrorist financing, we all need to do the same thing. We need to quite simply apply the same rules everywhere.
King to respond to the debate.
Well, thank you very much. In particular, thanks again to Mr. Nart for the report, and thank you everyone for today's important debate. I just want to caution the suggestion that in some way we have defeated Daesh. We have made very welcome progress on the ground against the so-called caliphate, but jihadi extremist terrorism remains active in a number of countries, and the terrorist threat, including to us here in Europe, remains very high. They are still able to produce and spread poisonous propaganda. Indeed, we'll be announcing some new measures to tackle that aspect of the problem later today. They still have access to significant sources of funding and funds that they have previously raised. And that is why the work that you've been highlighting in this report to disrupt the sources of revenue of terrorist organizations, to limit their capacity to move and use funds, and to support law enforcement in their efforts to detect financial movements of terrorists in order to identify them and frustrate their plans and tackle the networks, is so important. I agree with those who've underlined the importance of making progress on information exchange and information sharing. I think we have made some progress. There is still more that needs to be done. And with your help and support, the support of this House, I hope that we will be able to, this year, agree to further strengthen the key law enforcement and information sharing networks and databases, and make sure that they work together effectively. In particular, we're going to come forward with further proposals to strengthen the network of financial intelligence units and the ability of law enforcement to work with those units, and I hope you will support that. I agree with those who've spoken about the transnational character of the terrorist threat, and that is why we need a common European approach. And that approach needs to be rooted in and complementary with actions taken at national level and international cooperation. That's our objective. That's the work that we're pursuing with your help and support to continue to build an effective security union to better protect our citizens. Thank you.
And thank you, Commissioner. For 1 minute now, our rapporteur, Mr. Nart.
Una cuestión tan extraordinariamente.
On such an extremely sensitive and important issue, we've had over 280 amendments, but there's full consensus, and the groups are happy. So is Commissioner King, and so am I. Thank you.
And thank you. Colleagues, this debate is closed, and we vote later this morning. And we will now move to the next item on our agenda. And while I introduce that item, I invite our commissioners to trade places, please, as we continue with our debates. And we welcome Commissioner Jourova, and we say goodbye to Commissioner King. The next item on our agenda is a report by Madam Bilbao Barandica